Welcome to Shiver Audiobooks. We're thrilled to have you back with us. They say your hearing is your most reliable sense, a comforting thought in a world that never sleeps. But in the age of the invisible frequency, your ears can become your prison. The truth isn't found in what you see. It's hidden in the silence between the notes, in a flickering resonance you were never meant to notice. We all believe we are safe in our suburban sanctuaries. We trust the privacy of our smart homes and the security of our nightly routines. But what happens when the very technology designed to connect us becomes the hand that chokes us? What happens when a global symphony isn't about harmony, but about marking an expiration date for the human mind? You are about to enter a world of sensory noir and systemic betrayal. A world where Dylan Wilson and a handful of survivors are forced to step out of the quiet safety of their darkness and into a global crossfire of frequencies and blood. From the rain-slicked, echo-filled streets of a paranoid London to the obsidian heart of a machine that has forgotten the meaning of mercy. This is not a story of a technical glitch. This is a story of a sensory uprising. Because when a billion-dollar empire has been programmed to rewrite your reality, the only way to save your soul is to become the mute. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that unearth the shadows of the system, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep the signal alive. This is Blind Spot.
Chapter 1. The Sound of Silence. Dylan Wilson sat perfectly still in the center of his living room. To anyone else, the apartment was a void of shadows, a silent box in a noisy city. To Dylan, it was a complex, shifting map of frequencies. He didn't need light to know that his tea was getting cold on the mahogany side table. He could hear the steam ceasing its faint, rhythmic hiss. He didn't need to see the window to know the London rain was turning into a sleet storm. The soft tap, tap, tap against the glass had sharpened into a metallic, crystalline click. "Easy, Leo," Dylan whispered. At his feet, Leo, his black Labrador, shifted his weight. Dylan reached down, his fingers finding the familiar soft fur behind the dog's ears. He felt the vibration of a low huff, not a warning, just a dream. Dylan stood up. His movements were fluid, practiced. He didn't grope for furniture. He moved through the acoustic shadows of the room, sensing the mass of the bookshelf and the hollow space of the hallway by the way the heater's hum bounced off them. He walked toward his Steinway grand piano, the polished wood cool under his fingertips. He sat, his hands hovering just millimeters above the ivory keys. Then he heard it. Drop, dump, drag. The sound came from the apartment directly above his. Dylan froze. That wasn't Amelia. Amelia Rossi, the woman in 4B, was a creature of staccato. She moved like a hummingbird, quick, light, always in a rush. She wore heels that clicked like metronomes at 120 beats per minute. This person was heavy, at least 85 kilograms. They were wearing soft-soled shoes, rubber perhaps, or thick sneakers. The thump drag suggested a limp, or perhaps they were moving something substantial across the floorboards. Suddenly, a sharp, violent sound pierced the ceiling. A violin string snapping. Twang. It was followed by a sudden heavy crash that made the chandelier in Dylan's room rattle. Dylan's heart rate spiked. He could hear his own pulse thumping in his ears, a rapid, panicked drumbeat that threatened to drown out the world. "Amelia?" he muttered to the empty room. He stood up, his senses dialing into the ceiling. Most people heard noise from neighbors. Dylan heard narratives. He heard a muffled shout, a desperate gasp for air that was cut short by a wet, choking sound. Then, the most terrifying sound of all silence. Not the peaceful silence of a sleeping building, but the heavy, suffocating silence of a room where someone has stopped breathing. Suddenly, a new sound emerged from the hallway, just outside Dylan's own front door. A whistle. It was a slow, minor key melody, melancholic and jagged. The whistling was breathy, as if the person was smiling while they did it. It was a tune Dylan didn't recognize, an unfinished lullaby that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of his bones. Step, 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 step. The footsteps in the hallway stopped right in front of his door. Dylan held his breath. He felt Leo rise beside him, the dog's hackles brushing against Dylan's thigh. A low, vibrating snarl started in Leo's chest, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard. He heard a metallic click, a door handle being turned slowly. The wood of the door frame groaned under the pressure of someone leaning against it from the outside. The person wasn't knocking. They were testing the lock. Dylan reached for his phone on the piano, his fingers trembling. He swiped the screen, the voiceover feature whispering into his earbud at triple speed, but he didn't trigger the call. He couldn't. Because through the wood of the door he heard a voice. A man's voice whispering so softly it was almost a sigh. "I know you can hear me, Dylan. I know you're listening." A sudden, violent thunderclap shook the building, rattling the window panes. The whistling resumed, louder now, fading slowly as the footsteps moved toward the elevator at the end of the hall. Dylan's hand shook so hard the phone nearly slipped. He knew he should stay inside. He knew he should wait for the police, but the sound of that snapping violin string was echoing in his mind like a scream he couldn't ignore. He grabbed his white cane from the stand by the door. "Leo," he whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and resolve. "Find the stairs. Apartment 4B now." Dylan Wilson stepped out of the safety of his darkness, unaware that the man he was following hadn't left the building at all. The man was waiting in the one place Dylan's ears couldn't reach. The Blind Spot. Chapter 2. The Acoustic Grave. But the hallway of the apartment building was a wind tunnel. Dylan felt the cold draft from the broken window at the far end of the corridor biting at his face. To anyone else, the hallway was a carpeted strip of beige and fluorescent light. To Dylan, it was a long, echoing throat. Every tap of his white cane sent a sonar pulse rippling forward, bouncing off the textured wallpaper and the heavy oak doors of his neighbors. "Left, Leo, find the stairs," Dylan whispered. The Labrador's claws clicked rhythmically on the hardwood transition. They reached the stairwell door. Dylan felt the cold vibration of the metal handle. Usually the stairwell was a symphony of distant hums, the elevator cable groaning, the trash chute rattling, but tonight it felt hollow, empty. As they ascended the stairs to the 4th floor, Dylan's world began to change. The air grew thicker, carrying a scent that his brain struggled to categorize. It wasn't the usual smell of lavender floor wax or the faint aroma of Amelia's cooking. It was metallic, sharp, the smell of copper and ozone. He reached the landing of the 4th floor. Leo stopped abruptly, his body turning rigid against Dylan's leg. A low, guttural vibration started in the dog's throat. "I know, boy, I know," Dylan breathed. He moved toward apartment 4B. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was slightly ajar. He could hear the faint whistle of the draft catching the edge of the wood. Dylan reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the door's surface. He pushed it open. The acoustic signature of the room changed instantly. A large, open space, high ceilings, hardwood floors that amplified every microsound. But there was a new sound now, a steady, rhythmic drip, 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 falling onto a resonant surface, a wooden floor. Dylan stepped inside. The air in 4B was heavy with the silence he had feared. "Amelia?" His voice felt small, swallowed by the shadows of the room. He moved his cane in a wide arc. It struck something soft. He froze. He retracted the cane and knelt, his hand reaching out into the void. His fingers touched silk first a sleeve. Then something wet, something warm and viscous that coated his fingertips. He followed the arm upward until he touched a cold, still hand. Beside it, the shattered remains of a violin. He could hear the tension still held in the few unbroken strings, a ghostly hum that vibrated in the air. He found her throat. No pulse, just the terrifying stillness of a heart that had been silenced mid-beat. Dylan's breath came in ragged gasps. He stood up, his boots sticking slightly to the floor. Drip! Drip! Then a sound that made his blood turn to ice. A floorboard creaked. Not behind him, not in the hallway, in the room. Someone was standing in the corner of the apartment, breathing so shallowly that Dylan had missed it. The intruder was practiced, a ghost in the machine. But Dylan's ears, sharpened by years of darkness, caught the faint friction of fabric, the sound of a sleeve rubbing against a coat. "I know you're there," Dylan said, his voice a jagged edge. "I can hear your heart." It was a lie. He couldn't hear the heart, but he heard the sudden, sharp intake of breath that followed his statement. The intruder moved, not toward the door, but toward him. The footsteps were silent, but the air displaced by the person's movement gave them away. Dylan swung his cane, but it met only empty air. He backed away, his heel catching on the edge of a rug. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp electronic chirp. "Police, don't move!" The front door burst open. The heavy, authoritative thud of tactical boots flooded the room. Flashlights, useless to Dylan but blindingly bright in his mind, cut through the space. "Hands in the air! Drop the weapon!" Dylan realized with a jolt of horror that he was standing over Amelia's body, his hands covered in her blood, holding a heavy, metal-tipped cane. To the eyes of the law, he wasn't a witness. He was the silhouette of a killer. "I'm blind!" Dylan shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm blind! There's someone else here, in the corner!" "Clear!" a voice shouted. "East corner, clear! Nobody here but the suspect!" Dylan's head whipped toward the corner. Empty? He had heard the breath. He had felt the air move. A pair of heavy boots approached him. The sound of a leather holster creaking. The scent of cheap coffee and nicotine arrived a second before the voice did. "I'm Detective Emma Davis," the woman said. Her voice was husky, tired, and laced with a skepticism that felt like a physical weight. "Put the stick down, Mr. Wilson." Slowly. "He was just there," Dylan pleaded, his fingers still sticky with Amelia's blood. "I heard him. He was whistling. A minor key melody. He was in the corner when you came in." "There's no one here, Dylan," Davis said, her voice softening just enough to be patronizing. "The windows are locked from the inside. The door was the only way in and my team was in the hall. You're the only living thing in this room besides us and the dog." Dylan shook his head. "You didn't hear him. You don't know how to listen." "What I hear," Davis countered, the metal clink of handcuffs echoing in the small space. "It's a man with a history of trauma, found standing over a fresh corpse in a locked room. We're going to the station, Dylan. We're going to have a very long talk about what you think you heard." As they led him out, Leo whimpering at his side, Dylan passed the elevator. For a split second, the wind died down. In that moment of perfect clarity, he heard it again. From inside the elevator shaft, a faint, breathy whistle, the same jagged, unfinished lullaby. The killer wasn't gone. He was watching, and Dylan was the only one who knew he existed. Chapter 3. The Interrogation of Shadows. The interrogation room at the precinct was an acoustic nightmare. It was a small, boxy space with hard, reflective surfaces that caused Dylan's voice to bounce back at him with a hollow, mocking echo. There was a hum, a low-frequency buzz from the fluorescent lights above that most people ignored, but to Dylan, it felt like a drill pressed against his temple. Across the metal table, Detective Emma Davis sat. Dylan couldn't see her, but he knew exactly when she leaned forward. He heard the slight groan of her leather chair and the rustle of a heavy folder being opened. "Water?" she asked. The plastic cup hit the table with a sharp clack. "No, thank you," Dylan said, his voice flat. He kept his hands under the table. He had washed the blood off at the station, but he could still feel the phantom stickiness on his skin, a sensory stain that wouldn't fade. "Let's start again, Dylan, from the beginning." Davis's voice was different here, starker, stripped of the wind and rain of the crime scene. "You heard a struggle. You heard a violin string snap. You went upstairs, you found the body, and then you heard a ghost." "He wasn't a ghost," Dylan snapped. "He was a man, 85 kilograms approximately. rubber-soled shoes, a rhythmic gait with a slight hesitation on the right foot, and he was whistling. "The Whistler," Davis said, her pen scratching against paper. A rhythmic, irritating sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. "The problem is, Dylan, my officers were in that hallway within 60 seconds of your 911 call being logged. The service stairs were alarmed. The elevator was at the ground floor. Unless your killer can turn into smoke, he wasn't there." "He was in the room," Dylan insisted. "I felt the air move when he shifted. I heard his fabric synthetic, maybe a windbreaker rub against itself." Davis sighed. It was a long, weary sound that carried the weight of a dozen unsolved cases. "Dylan, I did my homework on the way over. 3 years ago you were in a car accident, a head-on collision. You lost your sight, yes, but the medical reports also mention post-traumatic hallucinations, auditory and visual distortions." Dylan flinched. The memory of the accident didn't come as a picture. It came as the sound of screeching tires and the sickening crunch of metal, a sound so loud it had felt like the world ending. "That was different," Dylan whispered. "That was my brain trying to fill the gaps of the darkness. This was real." "Is it real that your brother, Ethan Wilson, was seen near the building 40 minutes before the murder?" The silence that followed was heavy. Dylan felt the air in the room grow colder. "Ethan? No, he's in Bristol. His car was picked up by a traffic cam 3 blocks away," Davis said, leaning closer. Dylan could smell the mint she was chewing and attempt to hide the scent of cigarettes. "And we know about the money, Dylan. We know Amelia Rossi wasn't just a neighbor. She was a guarantor for one of Ethan's business loans, a loan that went south. If Amelia dies, that debt becomes complicated." Dylan felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. "Ethan." His brother's voice was a chaotic mess of jagged tones and forced cheerfulness, the sound of a man constantly running from his own shadow. Could Ethan have been the one in the room? No. The footsteps were wrong. The whistle was too controlled, too cold. "It wasn't Ethan," Dylan said firmly. "How can you be sure? You didn't see him." "I don't need to see to know my own brother's heartbeat, detective. He's always at 85 beats per minute when he's nervous. The man in that room, his breathing was as steady as a sleeping child's, even after he'd just killed a woman." Davis stopped writing. The silence stretched between them, interrupted only by the distant, muffled sounds of the busy precinct, telephones ringing, heavy doors slamming, the distant murmur of voices. Suddenly a door opened. A new set of footsteps entered the room. These were different. Expensive leather shoes, a confident, measured stride. "Detective Davis, I'm sorry to interrupt," a new voice said. It was smooth, resonant, and had a melodic quality that felt like a warm velvet blanket. "I'm Soren Clark. I live in 4C, right across from Amelia. The officers outside said I could provide a statement." Dylan's ears pricked up. Soren Clark, the name from the mailbox. But as Soren spoke, Dylan felt a shiver of pure, unadulterated dread. There was something wrong with Soren's voice. It was too perfect. Beneath the warmth there was a strange metallic resonance, a dissonance that Dylan usually only heard in broken instruments. It was the sound of a voice being carefully performed rather than spoken. "Mr. Clark," Davis said, her tone shifting to something more professional. "Thank you for coming. You were home this evening?" "I was," Soren said. He sat down in the chair next to Dylan. Dylan could smell his cologne, expensive, woody, with a hint of sandalwood. "I heard the commotion. It's a tragedy. Amelia was a light in this building." As Soren spoke, he shifted his weight. Drag. Dylan's heart stopped. The sound was faint, dampened by the precinct's thin carpet, but it was there. The same rhythmic hesitation he had heard through his ceiling. "You?" Dylan whispered, turning his sightless eyes toward the sound of Soren's breathing. "I beg your pardon?" Soren asked, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "Dylan, isn't it? We haven't officially met. I've seen you. Well, I've passed you in the hall with your dog." "You were there," Dylan said, his voice rising. You were the one whistling. I know that gait. I know that breath. Dylan, sit down, Davis warned. Detective, he's lying. Dylan stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. Listen to his voice. He's modulating it. Mr. Wilson, please, Soren said softly. He reached out, his hand brushing Dylan's arm in a gesture of comfort. Dylan recoiled as if burned. When Soren's hand touched him, he felt a strange, sharp vibration, the chime of a watch or a ring hitting the metal table. But in that split second of contact, the background noise of the precinct seemed to drop away. For a heartbeat, Dylan didn't hear the police station. He heard a recording, a faint, high-pitched hiss, like a digital file being played back loop. Before he could process it, Davis grabbed his shoulder. That's enough. Dylan, go home. We have your statement. Mr. Clark, if you'll follow me to the other room. Dylan was led out of the interrogation room, his mind reeling. He found Leo waiting for him by the front desk, the dog's tail giving a single uncertain wag. As Dylan walked out of the station and into the cold night air, the rain had stopped, leaving the city eerily quiet. He stood on the sidewalk, his ears straining for any sign of danger. And then from the shadows of a nearby alleyway it came. A low, breathy whistle, the minor key lullaby. It wasn't coming from the precinct. It was coming from the car parked directly in front of him. The killer wasn't Soren Clark. The killer was using Soren. And as Dylan stood there paralyzed, he realized the first great twist of his nightmare. He wasn't just an ear witness. He was the conductor of a symphony he didn't yet understand. Chapter 4: The Whispering Walls. The return to the apartment complex was not a homecoming. It was an entry into a tomb. The air in the lobby was stagnant, smelling of wet wool and the ozone of the elevator motor. Dylan's cane clicked against the marble floor, but the sound felt different now, flatter, as if the building itself was bracing for something. Home, Leo, Dylan murmured. The dog didn't pull with his usual confidence. He kept his tail tucked, his paws treading softly as if afraid to wake the floorboards. When they reached the door to apartment 3B, Dylan paused. He didn't use his key immediately. He pressed his ear to the wood. Silence. But not a pure silence. It was a weighted silence. The apartment felt occupied. He could hear the hum of his refrigerator, the ticking of the grandfather clock, and the distant gurgle of the pipes. But there was a new frequency, a micro-hum, a tiny, high-pitched whine that sat at the very edge of human hearing. He unlocked the door. The air inside was too warm. Someone had been here. Bullen stood in the entryway, his senses expanding like a net. He didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need them, but he felt the subtle shift in the room's acoustics. A chair had been moved 3 inches to the left. The velvet curtains by the window were vibrating differently, no longer absorbing the sound of the street but reflecting it. Someone has changed the geometry of my room, Dylan thought. He walked to the center of the living room. I know you're in here, he said to the darkness. No answer. Only the tick, tick of the clock. He moved toward his piano. He needed the grounding of the ivory keys, but as he sat down, he heard it again, that microscopic whine. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the piano. Dylan reached into the belly of the Steinway, his fingers dancing over the cold steel strings. Near the dampers of the middle C, his fingertips brushed against something that didn't belong. A small, adhesive disc. Smooth plastic. A microphone. His heart gave a violent thud. He didn't pull it off. If he pulled it off, they would know he knew. He moved his hand away, his breath hitching. He began to search the rest of the room with his ears. He heard the same whine behind the bookshelf. Another near the air vent. His home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a laboratory, and he was the subject under a microscope. Drud. The sound from upstairs started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't in Amelia's apartment. It was directly above his bedroom. It was slower, more deliberate. It sounded like someone was tracing his movements from above, step for step. Dylan retreated to the kitchen, his mind racing. He needed to think, but the whistler's tune was stuck in his head like a parasite. He reached for a glass, but his hand stopped midair. The pipes. The water pipes in old buildings like this acted as conductors. If you pressed your ear to them, you could hear vibrations from floors away. Dylan knelt by the sink, pressing his temple against the cold copper pipe. At first, there was only the rushing of water, then a voice. "Not yet," the voice whispered. It was a man's voice, but it wasn't Soren Clark's velvet tone. It was rougher, like sandpaper on glass. "He's listening. He's always listening. We have to wait for the brother to move." "And the detective?" another voice asked. Dylan's blood turned to ice. It was Emma Davis. "She's handled," the sandpaper voice replied. "She's looking at the brother. It's like we planned. If Wilson hears too much, we just trigger the episode. No one believes a man who sees ghosts in the dark." Dylan pulled away from the pipe, that breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The detective was in on it, or she was being played so perfectly she might as well be. And they were waiting for Ethan. Suddenly, Leo let out a sharp, panicked bark. Dylan scrambled toward the sound. The wind howled through the broken pane, bringing the scent of wet asphalt and something chemical bleach. "Leo, back!" Dylan shouted. He heard the heavy landing of boots on his bedroom floor. This wasn't the rhythmic thump drag. This was someone fast, someone agile. "Dylan Wilson," a voice hissed. It was a voice he didn't recognize, thin and reedy. "You have something that doesn't belong to you. Amelia gave it to you. The recording." "I don't have anything," Dylan cried, swinging his white cane blindly in the dark. He heard the whistle, not from the hallway this time. It was right in front of his face. The minor key lullaby breathed directly into his ear. "Check the piano," the voice whispered. Dylan felt a sharp sting in his neck and needle. He tried to scream, but his throat felt like it was filling with cotton. The world began to tilt. The sounds of the room, the ticking clock, the howling wind, Leo's barking began to stretch and distort, turning into a terrifying dissonant roar. As he collapsed, his vision, that blind void, suddenly exploded. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't see darkness. He saw a flash of a face with no eyes, just hollow pits of sound. It was the first sign of the second twist. His sight was coming back, but it wasn't bringing light. It was bringing a nightmare. Dylan hit the floor, the last thing he heard being the sound of his piano keys being smashed all at once, a final chaotic chord. Chapter 5. The first whistle consciousness didn't return to Dylan all at once. It leaked back into his mind like cold water through a cracked ceiling. First came the smell, damp concrete, rotting cardboard, and the sharp, antiseptic sting of the chemical they had injected into his neck. Then came the sound. It was a low-frequency thrum, a mechanical vibration that felt like it was vibrating in his very teeth. He was in a large, hollow space. The acoustics were too cavernous for an apartment. The reverb told him the ceiling was at least 20 feet high. He tried to move his hands, but his wrists were bound behind him with zip ties. The plastic bit into his skin with every pulse of his heart. "Leo?" he croaked. His throat felt like it had been scraped with steel wool. No bark, no jingle of a collar. The silence where his dog should be was a physical ache in his chest. And then the nightmare truly began. Dylan blinked. It was a reflex he hadn't thought about in 3 years. Usually, blinking changed nothing. The void remained. The void, but this time, something happened. A jagged streak of white light tore across his field of vision. It wasn't light from a lamp or the sun. It was a visual representation of a sound. A heavy door slammed in the distance, and in Dylan's mind a silver shockwave rippled through the darkness, momentarily illuminating the skeletal outlines of metal shelving and a concrete pillar. "I'm not seeing the world," he realized, his breath hitching. "I'm seeing the echoes." Step, step, step. The footsteps were coming from his right. Each footfall sent a pulse of gray light through his brain. He saw the shape of the floor, rough, uneven. He saw the shape of the man approaching him. But it wasn't a man. It was a distorted, flickering shadow, a glitch in the darkness. "You're awake," the voice said. It was the sandpaper voice he had heard through the pipes, rough, jagged like a broken record. "Where's my dog?" Dylan demanded. His own voice created a flicker of blue light that illuminated a small patch of the man's chest. He saw a dark jacket, synthetic, just as he'd guessed. "The animal is sleeping," the man said. "For now, you should worry more about your brother, Dylan. Ethan is a very hard man to find when he owes people money, but he'll come for you, won't he? The loyal, blind little brother." "I don't know where he is," Dylan said, his head spinning. The man leaned in close. The smell of his breath was stale coffee and old iron. "We know Amelia gave you the key, not a physical key, a frequency. She hid a digital file in a piece of music. She told her lawyer she'd sent it to the only man who could truly hear it." Dylan's mind raced back to the evening of the murder, the violin string snapping, the crash, the silence, the final note. "I don't have it," Dylan whispered. The man didn't respond with words. Instead, he began to whistle. It was the melody, the minor key lullaby. But now that Dylan could see the sound, the whistle appeared as a series of sharp, needle-like shards of violet light, dancing in the air between them. The tune was hypnotic, but as it progressed, Dylan noticed something. The melody was a code. The intervals between the notes weren't musical, they were mathematical. Each rise and fall in pitch corresponded to a coordinate or a cipher. Amelia hadn't just sent him a file, she had taught him the key through the walls of her apartment. "You're whistling it wrong," Dylan said suddenly. The violet shards of light froze. The man stopped whistling. "What did you say?" "The third transition," Dylan said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You're flat. It's not a C natural, it's a C sharp. That's why you haven't found what you're looking for. You don't have the ear for it." The man snarled, a sound that exploded in Dylan's vision like a red firework. He felt a heavy hand grip his throat, slamming his head back against the concrete pillar. "Tell me the rest of it," the man hissed, "or I start cutting pieces off the dog." In that moment of pain and terror, Dylan's echo vision surged. The vibration of the man's snarl acted like a sonar flare. For a split second, Dylan saw the entire room in high-definition silver. The crates of stolen art, the surveillance monitors showing his own apartment, and a small trembling shape in a cage in the corner. Leo. But he saw something else. Behind the man, near the heavy metal door, was a figure, a woman. She was standing perfectly still, her heartbeat, a steady, rhythmic pulse that Dylan could see as a soft, rhythmic glow in the dark. It was Detective Emma Davis. She wasn't pointing a gun at the killer. She was holding a phone, recording the conversation. She wasn't there to save him. She was there to collect the key once Dylan broke. "The rest of the tune," Dylan said, his voice trembling but clear, "ends with a dissonance, like this." Dylan didn't whistle. He screamed a high-pitched, piercing frequency he had learned as a boy to test the acoustics of concert halls. The sound was a blinding white explosion in his own mind, but it did exactly what he hoped. The piercing tone hit the resonant frequency of the overhead light fixtures and the glass monitors. The bulbs exploded, the monitors shattered. In the sudden chaos of real darkness and sensory overload, the killer staggered back, blinded by the glass. Dylan, who lived in the dark, didn't blink. He used the afterglow of his screen to see the zip ties on his wrists. He threw his weight to the side, catching the sharp edge of a shattered monitor base against the plastic. Snap! His hands were free. "Davis!" the killer screamed. "Kill the lights! Get him!" But Dylan was already moving. He didn't run like a blind man. He ran like a predator who had just found his eyes. "Leo, to me!" The sound of his voice guided the dog, and the sound of Leo's frantic paws on the concrete guided Dylan. He reached the cage, ripped the latch open, and felt the warm, wet lick of a grateful tongue. But as he turned to find the exit, a new sound filled the warehouse. A recording. It was his own voice from the interrogation room, played back at a distorted speed. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't Ethan. And then the voice of his brother Ethan screaming in agony. Dylan froze. The vision in his head flickered. This wasn't a sound in the room. This was a broadcast directed at him. "Choose, Dylan!" Emma Davis's voice rang out, no longer pretending to be the skeptical cop. "The key for your brother's life. You have 10 seconds before I press delete on his heart rate." Dylan stood in the center of the dark warehouse, his dog at his side, his eyes seeing a world of terrifying vibrations. He realized then that Twist 1 was just the beginning. The betrayal went deeper than the police. It went into his own blood. Chapter 6. The Sound of Betrayal. The air in the warehouse was a thick soup of dust and the metallic tang of shattered electronics. In Dylan's mind, the world was a strobe light of silver and gray, fueled by the echoes of his own ragged breathing. He stood by the open cage, his hand buried in Leo's fur, feeling the dog's heart racing like a hummingbird against his palm. 10 seconds, Dylan, Emma Davis's voice echoed. She was moving now. He could hear the click of her heels, not the heavy tactical boots she'd worn at the apartment, but something sharper, more predatory. She was circling him, using the cavernous space to distort the direction of her voice. To anyone else, she was a ghost in the dark. To Dylan, she was a ripple in the static. "The recording you heard," Ethan's voice, Dylan said, his own voice sounding hollow in the vast space. "It was too clean. No background noise, no hum of the city. You're playing a file from 3 years ago, the night of the accident." The silence that followed was sharp. Dylan felt the vibration of Davis freezing in place. "You always were too smart for your own good, Dylan," Davis said, her voice dropping the facade of the weary detective. It was now cold, surgical. "But does it matter if the scream is old if I can make a new one right now? Ethan is in the room. He's just indisposed." Dylan strained his ears. He looked past the silver ripples of the room's acoustics. He ignored the hum of the remaining lights and the drip of water from a distant pipe. He listened for the Wilson pulse, the specific, erratic rhythm of his brother's heart that he had known since childhood. He found it. It wasn't a scream. It was a faint, wet wheeze coming from a wooden crate 20 feet to his left. Ethan was there, drugged or gagged, but alive. "The key," Davis demanded. "Whistle it, the full sequence, now." Dylan realized then that the whistler hadn't been a person. It was a pursuit. They had all been trying to mimic the frequency Amelia had hidden. But Amelia hadn't hidden it in a melody. She was a violist. She understood that music isn't just about notes, it's about the resonance between them. "The key isn't a tune," Dylan said, his voice gaining a strange, eerie calm. "Amelia didn't give me a song. She gave me a frequency that shatters digital encryption. You don't want a password, you want the tone that opens the Rossi vault." "Whistle it," the sandpaper-voiced man hissed from the shadows. Dylan saw the red blur of the man's movement. He was raising a gun. Dylan closed his eyes, even though it made no difference to his sight. He focused on the memory of the night Amelia died. The snap-in string, twang. That wasn't a string breaking. It was a tuning fork. Amelia had struck a specific frequency on her viola just before she was struck down. It was a 440 hertz, a note, but with a microtonal shift, a dissonance that only a concert-grade ear could reproduce. "If I do this," Dylan said, "you'll kill us both anyway. Because once I whistle it, I'm the only copy of the key left in the world." "You're already dead, Dylan," Davis said, her footsteps getting closer. "You're just a dead man who can still hear. Now give it to me, or I let Soren finish what he started with Amelia." Dylan's head whipped toward the sound of Davis's voice, but his echo vision caught something she hadn't intended. As she spoke, he heard a faint electronic beep from her pocket. A radio transmission. "Target in sight. Davis is compromised. Take them both out." The voice on the radio wasn't Soren's. It wasn't the sandpaper man's. It was the chief of police. Dylan realized the betrayal went even deeper. Davis wasn't the mastermind, she was a loose end. This wasn't a construe for a simple murder. This was a state-level silencer. Amelia had discovered something in her travels with the orchestra, something she'd recorded and hidden behind a sonic wall. "Emma!" Dylan shouted. "Check your radio! They're not waiting for the key. They're waiting for the signal to burn this building down." For a second, the predator became the prey. Dylan heard Davis's heart rate skyrocket, a sharp staccato thump 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 that he could practically see as a red glow in the dark. He heard the rustle of her jacket as she reached for her radio. "Base, this is Davis. Do you copy?" Silence. Only the static of a jammed signal. "They jammed us," she whispered, the realization hitting her voice like a physical blow. "The Whistler isn't one of them," Dylan realized aloud, his mind clicking through the sounds. "The whistling, it's a warning system. Someone has been trying to keep me away from the truth by scaring me." Suddenly, the warehouse doors groaned. Not the heavy main doors, but the skylights above. "Down!" Dylan screamed. He tackled Davis just as a hail of silenced gunfire raked the concrete where she had been standing. The silver ripples in Dylan's mind turned into a chaotic storm of white noise. The drone was using a sonic emitter, a weapon designed to disorient and deafen. To Davis, it was just a loud, irritating hum. To Dylan, it was like having his brain seared with a hot iron. "The key!" Davis yelled over the roar, her hands over her ears. "If that file is what I think it is, it's the only leverage we have. Whistle it, Dylan! Whistle it into my phone!" Dylan pulled himself up, his head throbbing, his vision flickering between darkness and blinding white light. He saw Leo cowering near the crate where Ethan was held. He saw the red laser sights of the tactical team appearing on the walls like bloodstains. He had to do it, not to save his life, but to weaponize the truth. Dylan took a deep breath, ignoring the agony in his ears. He didn't whistle a lullaby. He whistled a single, piercing, dissonant note that vibrated with a strange metallic edge. As he held the note, the warehouse lights didn't just flicker, they exploded in a rhythmic pattern. The drones in the air began to wobble, their gyroscopes failing as the frequency hit their sensors. "Did you get it?" Dylan gasped, collapsing to his knees. Davis looked at her phone. The file was uploading. "Got it. God help us, Dylan. I just saw the file name." "What is it?" Davis's voice was a whisper of pure terror. "It's not art. It's the black box recording from the car accident 3 years ago. The one that blinded you." Dylan froze. The accident hadn't been an accident, and Amelia hadn't been a neighbor. She had been the witness who had been hiding the truth in plain sound for 3 years. "Dylan," Davis said, her voice shaking, "you weren't meant to survive that crash. And the person driving the other car, he's in this room." Dylan turned his head. He didn't listen for Davis, he didn't listen for the drones, he listened for the one sound he had never been able to forget. The sound of a specific gold-encrusted lighter clicking open. Click. From the far end of the warehouse, the Whistler finally stepped out of the shadows. "Hello, little brother," the voice said. It wasn't Ethan. It was a voice Dylan hadn't heard in 3 years. A voice he thought was buried in a grave. "Father." Chapter 7. Blood Ties. The world didn't just go silent. It felt as if the air had been sucked out of the warehouse. Dylan stood frozen, his hand still gripping Davis's shoulder for balance. The voice that had just spoken was a ghost, a deep, resonant baritone that had once filled concert halls and Dylan's own childhood home with the weight of expectation. Arthur Wilson. His father wasn't supposed to be here. Arthur Wilson had died in the same twisted heap of metal that had taken Dylan's sight. At least that was the story the lawyers, the police, and Ethan had told him. "Father?" Dylan's voice was a ragged thread. In his mind's eye, the silver ripples of his echo vision began to warp. The man standing 50 feet away wasn't a flickering glitch anymore. Arthur's presence was massive, a solid pillar of silence that seemed to absorb all other sounds. Dylan heard the slow, deliberate click of the gold lighter again. Flick-clack. The smell of expensive tobacco, the same scent that had haunted Dylan's hospital room for months, drifted across the damp concrete. "You look well, Dylan," Arthur said. The voice was cold, devoid of the warmth a father should show a son returned from the dead. "A bit more sensitive than I remember. You always did have the better ear." Ethan was always a disappointment in that regard. "Jide," Dylan whispered. "I heard the engine explode. I heard the sirens. They told me you were gone." "They told you what was necessary to keep the family name intact," Arthur replied. His footsteps began measured, heavy, the stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Each step sent a sharp, white pulse through Dylan's vision. The accident was a messy affair, Dylan. A collision of interests, not just cars. You were never meant to be in that vehicle. You were a variable I hadn't accounted for. Emma Davis moved beside Dylan, her gun leveled toward the sound of Arthur's voice. "Stay back, Mr. Wilson, or whatever the hell you are now. I have the file. It's already on a secure server." Arthur laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound like dead leaves on a sidewalk. "Detective Davis, always so literal. You think a digital file on a police server means anything? In 5 minutes, that server will experience a catastrophic hardware failure. The only thing that matters is what Dylan carries in his head." "Leave him alone," a new voice groaned from the left. It was Ethan. Dylan heard his brother struggling against the wooden crate, the sound of ropes straining against skin. Ethan's voice was thick with pain and shame. "Dylan, I'm sorry I couldn't tell you. He wouldn't let me." Dylan's heart felt like it was being squeezed by a cold hand. Ethan hadn't just been a victim, he had been a jailer. He had lived with Dylan for 3 years, knowing their father was alive, knowing that the accident was a sanctioned hit. "Why, father?" Dylan asked, his voice gaining a sudden dangerous clarity. "Why, Amelia, why the file?" "Amelia Rossi was a thief," Arthur said, his voice coming closer. Dylan could hear the fabric of Arthur's wool coat, the soft, expensive rustle of cashmere. "She was hired to document the transition of certain assets. But she got greedy. She thought she could use the recording of the crash to blackmail the very people who built this city. She hid the decryption key in a frequency, knowing I was looking for her. She knew I'd come for you eventually." "Because you knew I'd hear what no one else could," Dylan realized. He remembered the crash now, not as a memory of light but as a memory of sound. Beneath the screaming tires and the breaking glass there had been a third sound, a high-pitched electronic pulse, a signal. "The crash wasn't meant to kill you, Dylan," Arthur said, now only 10 feet away. "It was meant to trigger the signal. It was a test of a sonic weapon. Amelia recorded the telemetry of that failure. That's what's on the file. The proof that we are turning the city's own infrastructure into a weapon of crowd control." Suddenly, Dylan's vision flared. The drone above began to descend, its hum rising to a glass-shattering shriek. "The choice is simple, Dylan," Arthur said, his voice barely audible over the drone. "Come with me. We rebuild your career. We fix your eyes, truly fix them. Or I let the detective and your brother stay here while the cleanup crew finishes their work. The warehouse is rigged, Dylan. Not with explosives, but with sound. In 60 seconds a frequency will be emitted that will liquefy the internal organs of everyone in this room. Everyone except the person wearing the dampening headset I'm holding." Dylan heard the faint clink of metal. Arthur was holding out a headset. "Dylan, don't!" Emma Davis yelled. But Dylan wasn't looking at Emma. He was looking at the sound of Arthur's breathing. He noticed a tiny rhythmic skip in his father's heart, a weakness. And then Dylan heard it. The third twist was beginning to whisper in his ear. Arthur wasn't wearing a dampening headset. Arthur was already wearing a hearing aid, a very sophisticated, very delicate piece of medical technology. Dylan gripped his white cane, his fingers finding the small, concealed button he had installed months ago, a simple modification for a blind man who liked to tune his own piano. It was a high-frequency pitch pipe designed to emit a pure, piercing tone. "You're right, Father," Dylan said, his voice calm. "I always did have the better ear." Dylan didn't reach for the headset. He reached for his cane. "Leo, cover." Dylan pressed the button. A sound higher than the drone, higher than a human scream, ripped through the warehouse. To Emma and Ethan, it was a painful whistle. To Arthur, whose hearing aid amplified every surrounding frequency to compensate for his age, it was a literal explosion inside his skull. Arthur let out a sound that wasn't human. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his ears as the feedback loop in his hearing aid turned into a lethal screech. "Now!" Dylan shouted to Davis. "Get Ethan, get out!" But as Dylan turned to run, his vision did something it had never done before. The silver ripples didn't just show the room, they began to show colors. The red of the heat from the drone's motor, the deep blue of the cold air rushing in, and a blinding golden glow coming from his father's pocket. It wasn't a lighter, it was the real Rossi key, a physical device that responded to the frequency Dylan had whistled earlier. Dylan didn't run for the door. He ran toward the man who had blinded him. He had to know the truth of the accident. He had to hear the rest of the recording. As he reached Arthur, the warehouse walls began to vibrate. The clean-up frequency had started. The very air began to hum with a deadly, low-pitched throb. Chapter 8. The Resonance of Truth. The air in the warehouse didn't just vibrate, it became a physical weight. The low-frequency clean-up pulse was a sub-bass throb that Dylan felt in his marrow. It was a sound designed not to be heard but to be felt until the soft tissues of the body began to vibrate in sympathy with the walls. In Dylan's mind, the world had transformed. The silver ripples of his echo vision were being flooded by a chaotic aurora of colors. The lethal frequency appeared as a deep, bruising purple that rippled across the floor like thick oil. Against this, the golden glow from Arthur's pocket was a lighthouse beam, cutting through the violet murk. "Dylan, we have to go!" Emma Davis's voice was distorted, the sound waves being torn apart by the sonic interference. She was dragging Ethan toward the loading dock, her movements sluggish as if she were wading through chest-high water. Dylan didn't follow. He lunged toward the purple shadow that was his father. Arthur Wilson was curled on the concrete, his hands clawing at the hearing aid that was now a glowing white coal of agony in his ear. The high-frequency pitch from Dylan's cane had created a feedback loop that had effectively short-circuited the man's sensory input. Dylan reached into Arthur's cashmere coat. His fingers brushed against something cold, heavy and vibrating with its own internal rhythm. Pulled it out. It was a small, sleek cylinder, the Rossi key. As soon as Dylan's skin touched the metal, the color in his mind shifted again. The golden light intensified, and suddenly a voice began to play not through his ears but directly through the bones of his hand, a process of bone conduction that made the sound bypass the chaotic noise of the room. "Test subject." Alpha confirmed, the voice on the recording whispered. It was Arthur's voice, younger, colder. "The impact will occur at 22:14. Ensure the younger son is in the passenger seat. We need to measure the trauma-induced auditory spike. The brother, Ethan. He's agreed to the payout." Dylan's world tilted. The accident wasn't a test of a weapon. He was the test. They had blinded him on purpose to see if they could artificially evolve a human ear to act as a receiver for their sonic signals. And Ethan, his own brother, had sold his sight for a check. "Dylan, please," Arthur groaned, his voice a pathetic rasp beneath the roar of the building. Dylan stood over him. The purple waves of the clean-up frequency were intensifying. He could feel his lungs starting to ache, his vision flickering with bursts of static. He looked at the man who had sired him and then dismantled him for a laboratory result. "You didn't fix me, Father," Dylan said, his voice vibrating with the power of the Rossi key. You broke the world so I'd be the only one who could hear you scream. Dylan grabbed Arthur's gold lighter, the one with the clicking sound that had been the soundtrack to his nightmares, enveloped it with the Rossi key and squeezed. A sharp, dissonant tone erupted from the device. The violet waves of the warehouse's sonic weapon hit the frequency Dylan had created and shattered. For a few meters around Dylan, the air became perfectly, eerily still. A pocket of silence in the middle of a hurricane. "Dylan, the roof!" Ethan's voice screamed. The acoustic, structural integrity of the warehouse was failing. The vibration had found the resonant frequency of the steel girders above. They were humming a death note. Dylan looked toward the loading dock. He saw Emma Davis and Ethan. Ethan was looking back, his face a mask of terror and guilt. Dylan saw the color of Ethan's shame, a murky, sickly green that clung to him. "Leave him, Dylan!" Emma shouted, pointing at Arthur. "The building is coming down!" Dylan looked back at his father. Arthur was reaching out, his eyes wide, his mouth moving in a silent plea. In that moment, Dylan had a choice. He could save the man who had turned him into a freak, or he could let the silence claim the monster. Dylan reached down. He didn't grab Arthur's hand. He grabbed the dampening headset Arthur had dropped. He didn't put it on himself. He threw it. The headset skittered across the concrete, landing inches from Arthur's face. "Wear it and live with what you did," Dylan said. "Or don't. I'm done listening to you." Dylan turned and ran. He didn't use his cane. He didn't need it. He ran toward the blue light of the exit, his feet finding the path through the violet shadows with a grace that was almost supernatural. He scooped up Leo as he passed the dog's hiding spot, the Labrador yelping in surprise as Dylan hoisted him onto his shoulders. He reached the loading dock just as the first steel girder snapped with the sound of a cannon shot. The weight of the warehouse roof began to pancake down. Emma and Ethan scrambled into the back of a waiting police cruiser. One Davis had apparently hot-wired. Dylan dived into the back seat just as the air behind them was replaced by a wall of dust and the scream of twisting metal. As the car roared away from the collapsing site, Dylan sat in the back, gasping for air. Leo pressed his cold nose against Dylan's cheek, his tail thumping against the upholstery. Beside him, Ethan was weeping silently. "Dylan, I didn't have a choice. He was going to kill us both back then. I thought if you were just blind, you'd be safe." Dylan didn't answer. He looked out the window. He couldn't see the city lights, not really, but he saw the hum of London. He saw the red warmth of the street lamps and the electric yellow of the power lines. He held the Rossi key in his hand. It was still warm. It was still whispering. "The recording doesn't end with the crash, Ethan," Dylan said, his voice cold as ice. Emma Davis looked at him in the rearview mirror. "What do you mean? We have the file. It's over." "No," Dylan said, his fingers tracing the vibrating metal of the key. "The recording keeps going. Amelia didn't just record the crash. She recorded the meeting that happened after, in the hospital, with the man who really funded the project." Dylan turned his head toward the front of the car. He didn't listen to Emma's heart. He listened to the car's radio. It wasn't playing music, it was emitting a very faint, very specific digital pulse. Dylan's color vision suddenly spiked. He realized that the blue light he had followed out of the warehouse wasn't the exit. It was a beacon. He looked at Emma Davis's silhouette. The color of her heartbeat wasn't the steady red of a stressed detective anymore. It was a cold, mechanical white. "You're not Emma Davis," Dylan whispered. The woman in the driver's seat didn't turn around. She didn't slow down. But her voice changed. The husky, tired tone of the detective vanished, replaced by a voice that was perfectly modulated, perfectly clear. The same voice Amelia had used on her final recording. "The real Emma Davis is at the bottom of the Thames, Dylan," the woman said. "And you just gave me exactly what I needed to finish your father's work." The car door locks clicked. A hiss of gas began to fill the cabin from the vents. Dylan realized with a jolt of terror that the vision he had was being fed to him. The Rossi key wasn't a decryption device, it was an interface. He wasn't seeing the world, he was seeing the simulation they wanted him to see. Chapter 9: The Digital Void. The hiss of the gas was a high-frequency white noise that Dylan's mind translated into a suffocating, oily fog of neon green. It swirled through the cabin of the speeding car, obscuring the blue and yellow echoes of the city outside. Beside him, Ethan's weeping stopped abruptly. There was a soft thud as his brother's head hit the window. Leo let out one final, confused whimper before his breathing turned into the heavy, rhythmic drone of a forced sleep. "Don't fight it, Dylan," the woman who looked like Emma Davis said. Her voice didn't come from the driver's seat anymore. It seemed to vibrate from the leather of the headrest, the dashboard, and the very air around him. "Your brain is a finely tuned instrument. We can't have you snapping the strings." Dylan held his breath, but he knew it was a losing battle. The gas wasn't just a sedative, it was a neural conductor. As it entered his system, the Rossi key in his hand began to glow with a blinding, agonizing brilliance. The vision he had been experiencing, the colors, the shapes, the outlines of the world began to glitch. The red street lamps stretched into infinite bleeding lines. The dashboard melted into a puddle of digital static. You're the one Amelia was talking to," Dylan gasped, his lungs burning. "The programmer." "Amelia was a beautiful mistake," the woman replied. "She thought she was saving you by hiding the truth in sound. She didn't realize that by sharpening your ears, she was simply installing the latest hardware. You aren't seeing the world, Dylan. You are seeing the interface of the Wilson-Rossi network." The world outside the window vanished. The sound of the car's engine was replaced by a low digital hum, a shepherd tone that seemed to rise forever without ever getting higher. Dylan felt weightless. Dylan opened his eyes. He knew he was still in the car or perhaps a facility, but his brain told him he was standing in a vast, infinite cathedral of light. It was a digital purgatory. "Where am I?" he shouted. His voice didn't echo, it simply died the moment it left his lips. "You are in the blind spot, Dylan," the voice of the imposter, Emma said. "The space between what you hear and what you think you see. We've been feeding you a sensory map for the last hour. Every color you saw in that warehouse was a line of code. Every truth you found was a breadcrumb. We laid out to see how your neural pathways would handle the data." Dylan's heart hammered a frantic, visible purple rhythm in his chest. "So, my father, the warehouse, it was a play?" "Oh, your father was real enough," she laughed. "He's a relic. He thought sound was a weapon. I know that sound is a language. He wanted to kill people with frequencies. I want to rewrite their reality with them. And you, Dylan, are the first citizen of my new world." Dylan forced himself to sink into the darkness. He tried to do what he had done for 3 years, just listen. But it was impossible. The Rossi key was fused to his palm, pumping a constant stream of false data into his auditory nerve. He saw a door that wasn't there. He heard the wind when there was none. He was being hacked. "Think, Dylan. Think like a musician," he told himself. "Every system has a resonant frequency. Every lie has a dissonance." He focused on the one thing they couldn't perfectly simulate: the physical sensation of his own body. He felt the cold metal of the Rossi key. He felt the vibration of the car weight. The car wasn't moving. If the car was moving at 60 miles per hour, there would be a specific lateral G-force on his inner ear. There would be a micro-vibration in the soles of his feet. But there was nothing. He was stationary. The sound of the engine was a recording. The vision of the street was a loop. "You're not driving," Dylan whispered. The cathedral of light flickered. A jagged crack of darkness appeared in the sky above him. "You're in a garage," Dylan continued, his voice growing stronger. "We never left the warehouse district. You're sitting in a stationary car pumping gas into the cabin and data into my head." "It doesn't matter if you know," the woman hissed. The Emma mask began to peel away in his mind, revealing a static-filled void. The upload is at 90%. Once it hits 100, your blind spot becomes your permanent reality. You'll never hear a true sound again. Dylan needed a dissonance, a sound so pure and so wrong for this digital world that it would crash the system. He didn't have his piano, he didn't have his pitch pipe, but he had his own anatomy. Dylan bit his tongue, hard. The sharp, metallic tang of blood filled his mouth. The sudden, intense spike of physical pain was a real signal that the simulation hadn't accounted for. In his vision, a massive red error code streaked across the white cathedral. He used the pain to ground himself. He reached out with his left hand, the one not holding the key, and felt for the door handle. His fingers found cold plastic, real plastic. "Stop him!" the woman screamed, her voice now a terrifying electronic screech. Dylan didn't try to fight the images. He ignored the fake fire that suddenly appeared to block his path. He ignored the fake screams of Ethan and Leo. He focused on the mechanical resistance of the door latch. Click! The door swung open. The digital cathedral shattered like a mirror. Dylan tumbled out of the car and hit cold, greasy concrete. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and old oil. He was in a small, dimly lit shipping container inside a larger garage. He gasped for air, his lungs purging the gas. His vision was still a mess, half blind, half neon fever dream. He could hear the real world again. He heard the woman stepping out of the driver's side. She wasn't Emma Davis. She was younger, dressed in a sharp gray tech suit, her eyes covered by a haptic visor. She was holding a suppressed pistol. "You should have stayed in the dream, Dylan," she said. "It was much kinder than what's coming next." Dylan scrambled backward, his hand hitting a metal workbench. His fingers closed around a heavy, cold object, a wrench. But he didn't throw it. He hit the workbench with it. The sound was a thunderclap. In the confined space of the shipping container, the resonance was massive. Dylan used the echo to map the room. He saw the woman's position. He saw the oxygen tanks feeding the gas, and he saw the Rossi key still glowing on the car seat. "Ethan! Leo!" Dylan yelled, his voice a weapon. The woman fired. The bullet whizzed past Dylan's ear, the sound of it cutting the air, giving him her exact coordinates. Dylan didn't run away. He ran at her. He used the wrench to strike every metal surface. He passed, creating a chaotic, blinding storm of sight that only he could navigate. To the woman, he was a madman making noise. To Dylan, he was a ghost moving through a forest of light. He slammed the wrench into the oxygen tanks. The hiss of escaping air became a white noise wall. "I don't need to see you to kill you," she screamed, firing wildly into the mist. "You don't understand." Dylan's voice came from everywhere and nowhere as he moved. "In this room, I'm the only one who knows what's real." He reached the car, grabbed the Rossi key and slammed it against the car's battery terminals. A massive electrical surge rippled through the device. The Rossi key didn't just break it, emitted a final, localized EMP, an electromagnetic pulse fueled by Dylan's own neural interface. The woman's haptic visor exploded in a shower of sparks. She screamed, clutching her face as her digital world died in a flash of blue fire. Dylan grabbed Ethan and the unconscious Leo, dragging them out of the container just as the gas caught a spark from the short-circuited battery. The explosion threw them onto the garage floor. Dylan lay there, his ears ringing, his vision finally settling into a familiar, peaceful darkness. No colors, no neon, just the quiet, honest void. But as he lay there, he realized the most chilling part of Twist 2. The woman's voice, before the visor exploded, she had called him Subject Alpha. And as his hearing slowly returned, he heard the sound of 100 other keys humming in the distance. He hadn't stopped the program. He had just finished his first trial. Chapter 10. The Echo Chamber. The ringing in Dylan's ears was no longer a symptom of the explosion. It was the frequency of the city itself. As he dragged Ethan and Leo through the oily shadows of the garage, the darkness felt different. It was no longer a void. It was an echo chamber, a vast, interconnected network of vibrations that Dylan could feel pulsing through the soles of his boots. "Ethan, wake up!" Dylan hissed, shaking his brother's shoulder. Ethan groaned, his breath smelling of the sedative gas. "Dylan, the car, the lights, everything was white." "It wasn't real, Ethan. None of it was." Dylan hauled his brother to his feet. Leo was already awake, standing low to the ground, his tail tucked between his legs. The dog's ears were twitching frantically. He was hearing it too. From the rafters of the garage a sound descended. It wasn't the roar of an engine or the heavy tread of boots. It was a swarm. "Drones!" Ethan whispered, looking up. "Dylan, there are dozens of them." "They aren't just drones," Dylan said, his head tilting as he analyzed the pitch. "They're mobile emitters. They're mapping the room using ultrasound. If they find our resonance, they'll lock on." Dylan realized that the woman in the shipping container, the programmer, was just the vanguard. The sensory soldiers were the next phase. They were a fleet of automated hunters designed to track the alpha subject. They didn't need cameras. They used the same sonar Dylan had spent 3 years perfecting. "Follow me," Dylan commanded, "and stay in the shadows of the sounds." "What does that even mean?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "The drones are pulsing," Dylan explained as they moved toward a heavy steel door at the back of the garage. "Every half-second they send out a ping. Between those pings there is a gap, a silence. We move during the silence. Stop when you hear the hum." It was a terrifying game of musical chairs in the dark. Move, freeze, move, freeze. Dylan led them through the skeletal remains of old machinery, using the noise of a dripping pipe and a distant humming generator to mask their own footsteps. He was painting a path of safety using the ambient acoustics of the warehouse district. They reached the door and slipped inside. They were in an old maintenance tunnel, narrow, damp, and perfectly resonant. "Where are we going?" Ethan gasped. "We need the one person who can tell us what part of the last 24 hours was real," Dylan said. "We need the real Emma Davis." "But the woman in the car, she said Emma was at the bottom of the Thames." "She was lying. Ethan, lies are easy when you control the eyes. But I heard Davis's heartbeat in that interrogation room. It had a specific, irregular mitral valve click. A physical defect. If I can find that sound in the city, I can find her." They navigated the tunnels for what felt like hours. Dylan's vision was still unstable. Flints of orange and cold blue light sparked in his mind whenever his cane struck the concrete. He was beginning to realize that the Rossi key hadn't just interfaced with his brain. It had changed it. He was becoming a living receiver. Suddenly, Dylan stopped. He pressed his ear to the damp brick wall. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. "A heartbeat," Dylan breathed. 2 levels up. It's faint, muffled by stone and water. "Lube-dub, click! Lube-dub, click!" "It's her." Dylan led them up a rusted spiral staircase that groaned under their weight. They emerged into the basement of an abandoned water pumping station on the edge of the river. The air was freezing, and the sound of the Thames rushing past the exterior walls was a constant, low-frequency roar. In the center of the room, strapped to a chair, was a woman. Dylan didn't need light to see the color of her pain, a jagged, pulsing violet. He moved toward her, his hands finding the ropes. "Detective." The woman's head rolled forward. Her breath was shallow. "Dylan, is that you?" It was her. The husky, tired voice was real this time. No digital sheen, no perfect modulation. Just a woman who had been beaten but not broken. "I'm here, Emma. I've got Ethan and Leo." Dylan started sawing at the ropes with a shard of glass he'd picked up. "Who did this to you?" "The same people who hired me to take your case," Davis coughed. "It was a setup from the start, Dylan. They needed a cynical cop to push you to make you desperate so your neural pathways would open up for the key. I realized too late. I tried to pull you out, but they snatched me from my apartment 3 days ago. 3 days ago? Ethan stammered. But she was at the crime scene. She was in the interrogation room. That was a deep fake, Davis said, her voice trembling as the ropes fell away. A haptic projection. You were talking to an avatar, Dylan. They've been simulating your entire reality since Amelia died. Dylan felt a wave of vertigo. Twist 1, the betrayal wasn't just about his father or Ethan. It was about the fact that he hadn't spoken to a real human being in days. He had been living in a curated acoustic dream. They used me, Dylan whispered, his hands clenching into fists. They used Amelia's death to trigger my evolution. And it worked, a voice boomed from the overhead speakers. The pumping station's lights flickered on, blindingly bright for Ethan and Emma, but for Dylan it was a massive white noise explosion in his mind. The drones from the garage had found them. They were hovering outside the high windows, their emitters directed inward. Subject Alpha. The voice of the programmer returned, echoing through the chamber. The real Emma Davis was a necessary variable. You needed to find her to prove you could filter through the noise of a citywide jammer. You've passed Chapter 10, Dylan. You are now fully calibrated. Calibrated for what? Dylan screamed at the ceiling. For the symphony, the voice replied. Look at your brother, Dylan. Really look at him. Dylan turned toward Ethan. His vision surged, the colors returning with a violent intensity. He didn't see Ethan's face. He saw a complex lattice of glowing gold wires beneath his brother's skin. Ethan. Dylan's voice was a ghost of a sound. What did they do to you? Ethan backed away, his eyes wide with horror. Dylan, I don't know. I don't feel anything. He's the conductor's baton, Dylan, the programmer whispered. Ethan has been carrying the transmitter since the accident. He's the reason you can see. He's the source of your vision. And now, he's going to help you broadcast the Rossi frequency to every ear in London. Suddenly, Ethan's body jerked. His mouth opened, but no voice came out. Instead, a pure, high-frequency tone began to emit from his very chest. Dylan fell to his knees, clutching his head. The sound was beautiful. The sound was lethal. It was the whistle, amplified 1,000 times. Stop it! Dylan cried. You're killing him! He's a small price to pay for the new world, the voice said. Now, Dylan, listen to the city. Listen to the millions of people waking up. You are their eyes now. You are their ears. Dylan realized the final, most horrific truth. He wasn't the hero of this story. He was the antenna for a sensory apocalypse. Chapter 11. The Art of Deception. The pumping station had become a gargantuan tuning fork. The high-frequency tone emitting from Ethan's chest was so pure it felt like a razor blade sliding through the air. In Dylan's mind, the room had dissolved into a blinding gold lattice. He could no longer see the walls or the floor, he could only see the vibration of the broadcast. Ethan was suspended in a state of rigid paralysis, his back arched, his eyes rolled back. The sound wasn't coming from his vocal cords. It was a resonance vibrating through his rib cage, turned into a human speaker by the implants the Wilsons had hidden in him for 3 years. Dylan, make it stop! Emma Davis screamed, her hands clamped over her ears. She was slumped against the brick wall, blood beginning to trickle from her nose. The frequency was already starting to rupture the delicate capillaries in her head. Dylan pulled himself across the floor, his muscles twitching in sympathy with the tone. Every time he touched the ground, a spark of jagged violet light shot through his vision. He was being overwritten. The programmer was using Dylan's brain as the processor and Ethan's body as the tower. Ethan, fight it! Dylan reached out, his hand brushing Ethan's shirt. The moment of contact was an explosion. Dylan didn't just feel his brother, he heard Ethan's entire history. He heard the hushed conversations Ethan had had with their father while Dylan slept. He heard the guilt, the shame, and the terrifying realization that Ethan had been turned into a ticking sensory bomb. He can't hear you, Dylan, The programmer's voice echoed, now sounding as if it were originating from inside Dylan's own skull. He is the carrier wave, and London is the receiver. Listen. Dylan tilted his head. Beyond the roar of the pumping station, he heard it. A low, rhythmic thrumming rising from the city. It was the sound of millions of smart devices, city speakers, and sirens all beginning to hum in unison with Ethan. The symphony had begun. I won't let you, Dylan wheezed. You have no choice. You are the only one who can harmonize the signal. If you resist, the dissonance will simply kill everyone in a 5-mile radius. Harmonize, and they simply see what we want them to see. Dylan realized the deception wasn't just about what was real. It was about who was in control. He looked at Emma Davis. He saw the color of her heartbeat slowing down. She wouldn't last another minute. He looked at Ethan. The gold lattice beneath Ethan's skin was glowing white-hot. Ethan was burning out. The art of deception, Dylan thought. If you can't stop the sound, you have to change the acoustics. But Dylan didn't try to pull Ethan away or shut him up. Instead, he grabbed the heavy iron wrench he had carried from the garage. He didn't strike Ethan. He struck the massive, hollow iron pipes of the pumping station. The sound was a massive, low-frequency counternote. What are you doing? The programmer hissed. Dylan struck again, and again. He wasn't just making noise, he was playing the building. The pumping station was a series of interconnected chambers and pipes designed to move thousands of gallons of water. It was, in essence, a giant pipe organ. Dylan began to move with a frantic, rhythmic grace. He opened the emergency pressure valves. The sound of high-pressure steam and rushing water flooded the room. To the drones outside, the acoustic signature of the building suddenly changed. The clear signal from Ethan was being drowned in a sea of white noise. The chaotic, unpredictable sound of rushing fluid. You're creating interference, the programmer screamed. You'll kill him. I'm giving him a shield, Dylan shouted back. By flooding the room with the sound of water, Dylan was creating an acoustic blur. The drone's sensors couldn't lock onto Ethan's frequency because the sound waves were bouncing off the turbulent water and steam, creating a feedback loop that traveled back up the signal. Dylan turned to Emma. The water! Get into the overflow channel! The water will dampen the vibrations! He grabbed Ethan, throwing his brother's limp body into the shallow trench of the overflow channel as the pumps began to roar. Dylan dived in after them, pulling Leo with him. The moment they submerged, the world changed. Water is a much denser medium than air. The high-frequency whistle that was killing them in the air became a dull, manageable throb underwater. Dylan pressed his forehead against Ethan's chest beneath the surface. He could see the signal now, but it was slowed down. It looked like slow-motion ripples of blue light. I can't stop the broadcast, Dylan realized, but I can modulate it. Using the Rossi key, which was still fused to his palm, Dylan began to hum into the water. He wasn't humming a melody. He was humming a phase shift, a frequency designed to cancel out the lethal spikes of the Rossi signal. He was becoming a human noise-canceling headphone for the city of London. In his mind, he saw the gold lattice in Ethan's body begin to dim. The symphony outside began to stutter. The sirens in the street returned to being sirens. The smart devices went silent. Subject Alpha, disconnect immediately, the programmer commanded, her voice flickering with digital panic. You are corrupting the data. That's the point, Dylan whispered into the water. Suddenly, the overhead lights in the pumping station didn't just flicker, they turned a deep blood red. The drones outside began to smash themselves against the windows, their programming overridden by the feedback Dylan was sending back up the line. One by one, the mechanical hunters fell from the sky, their ears blown out by the very subject they were trying to calibrate. Dylan pulled Ethan up for air. The high-frequency tone had stopped. Ethan was breathing shallowly, but he was alive. Dylan, Ethan coughed, water spraying from his lungs. I heard you. In the water, it was quiet. It's not over, Dylan said, looking toward the red-lit ceiling. The programmer is still in the system, and she knows where we are. Emma Davis climbed out of the channel, her face pale but determined. She's not just in the system, Dylan. I saw the telemetry on her tablet before they snatched me. She's not in some remote bunker. Then where is she? Emma pointed toward the floor. She's in the vault below the Rossi building. But Dylan, that building isn't across town. Dylan tilted his head, listening to the way the sound of the river bounced off the foundations of the pumping station. He heard a very specific, low-frequency hum coming from directly beneath them. A hum he recognized from his own apartment. She's here, Dylan realized. The pumping station is the Rossi building's foundation. The vault is right under our feet. Dylan stood up, his vision now, a sharp, cold crystalline blue. He didn't need a key to get in. He had the frequency of the locks memorized in his blood. Chapter 12. Broken Strings. The descent into the Rossi vault felt like walking into the throat of a great sleeping beast. As Dylan, Emma, and a staggering Ethan moved through the hidden bulkhead beneath the pumping station, the air grew unnervingly still. The roar of the Thames was replaced by a rhythmic, pressurized thrum, the sound of a multi-million-dollar cooling system keeping a massive server farm from melting down. In Dylan's mind, the crystalline blue of his vision began to sharpen into something terrifyingly detailed. He could see the data cables running behind the reinforced concrete walls. They looked like glowing veins of liquid light, pulsing with the stolen privacy of a city. Stay close, Dylan whispered. The floor is pressure sensitive. Every step you take creates a ripple. If I don't counter-vibrate the air with the key, the alarms will trigger. They reached a massive circular door, the entrance to the vault. It didn't have a keypad or a retinal scanner. It had a single polished brass plate in the center. A resonance lock, Dylan murmured. He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he held the Rossi key against the brass. He didn't whistle this time. He simply let the key talk to the door. The door swung open to reveal a room that looked less like a server farm and more like a high-tech recording studio. In the center, surrounded by glowing monitors, was a single chair, and on a pedestal next to it sat a violin case. Amelia's violin? Amelia, Dylan breathed, moving toward the case as if drawn by a magnet. Dylan, wait, Emma Davis warned, her hand on her holster. It's a trap. It has to be. But Dylan was already there. He opened the case. The instrument inside was shattered, crushed, as if someone had stepped on it with deliberate cruelty. But it wasn't the wood that caught Dylan's attention. It was the strings. They hadn't been removed. They had been replaced with hair-thin fiber optic cables. She wasn't just a musician, Dylan realized, his fingers hovering over the broken strings. She was the architect. Amelia Rossi didn't discover the weapon. She built it. Correct, Dylan. The voice came from the shadows at the back of the room. A woman stepped forward. She was dressed in a simple black silk suit, her hair pulled back into a severe bun. She looked like a conductor, but her eyes held the cold, calculating shimmer of an artificial intelligence. This was the programmer, in the flesh. Amelia was a visionary, the woman said, her voice echoing perfectly in the acoustically treated room. She realized that the human ear is the most vulnerable port in the body. She didn't want to kill, she wanted to symphonize. She wanted to remove the dissonance of human conflict by creating a shared sensory reality. By lobotomizing them with sound? Dylan spat. By turning them into puppets like you did to Ethan? The programmer smiled, a thin, joyless movement. Evolution is always painful for the subjects. Amelia understood that. But she lost her nerve at the end. She thought you were a purer subject because of your accident. She thought you could handle the frequency without losing your soul. She died trying to protect your autonomy, Dylan. A waste of a brilliant mind. Dylan felt a surge of rage, but as he stared at the broken violin, his echo vision caught a lingering resonance. He touched the G-string, the one made of fiber optics. Suddenly, a holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room. It wasn't a digital image, it was a sonic ghost, a reconstruction of a memory stored in the vibration of the strings. In the projection, he saw Amelia. She was sitting in this very room, her face streaked with tears. She was talking to someone Dylan couldn't see. "I can't do it, Arthur," the ghost of Amelia said. "Dylan is too strong. He'll hear the lie in the music. If we go through with the accident, his brain won't just adapt, it will fight back. You'll create a monster you can't control." Dylan froze. The accident wasn't Arthur's idea. It's Amelia's experiment. She hadn't been the victim who hid the truth to save him. She was the scientist who had orchestrated his blinding to see if her weapon worked on a person she loved. She loved the music more than the man. "Dylan," the programmer whispered, stepping closer. "She chose you because you were the only one with the capacity to become the master conductor. She hid the key in a frequency only you could hear because she wanted you to be the one to activate the system. She didn't die for your safety. She died to ensure no one else could touch her masterpiece." Dylan's world shattered. The woman he had mourned, the woman whose death had been the catalyst for his nightmare, was the one who had written the first note of his pain. "You're lying," Ethan whispered, clutching his chest. "She was my friend. She helped me." "She used your Gokschulden to get you into that car, Ethan," the programmer countered. "She was the one who paid for your silence." Dylan looked at the broken violin. He heard the broken strings, the sound of a lie so deep it felt like it was tearing his brain apart. His vision turned a violent, bruised crimson. "The symphony is ready, Dylan," the programmer said, gesturing to the chair in the center of the room. "The Rossi building is the antenna. All you have to do is sit. All you have to do is listen. You can fix the world. You can make them all hear the piece Amelia wanted." Dylan looked at Emma Davis. She was shaking her head, her eyes pleading. He looked at Ethan, the brother who had betrayed him out of fear and greed. And then he heard it. A tiny, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the broken violin. A heartbeat. Not Amelia's, not the programmer's. It was a recording Amelia had left for him, not in the frequency, but in the silence between the notes. "Dylan," the tiny, vibrating voice whispered through the bone conduction of the floor. "If you're hearing this, I am gone, and the symphony is inevitable. But every masterpiece has a flaw. Look for the blind spot in the code. In the middle of the crescendo, there is 1 second of total silence. That is where I hid the delete key. You have to be brave enough to choose the silence." Dylan looked at the programmer. He didn't see a villain. He saw a conductor waiting for her lead violinist. "I'll do it," Dylan said, his voice cold and hollow. "Dylan, no!" Emma screamed. "I'll do it," he repeated, stepping toward the chair. "I'll play the music, but I play it my way." As Dylan sat in the chair, a series of neural needles descended from the headrest, piercing the skin behind his ears. The world didn't just turn to color, it became a roaring, infinite ocean of sound. He was connected to every speaker, every phone, and every ear in London. He was the city, and the city was him. Chapter 13. The Silent Crescendo. The moment the neural needles made contact, the physical world vanished. Dylan Wilson ceased to be a man in a chair. He became a ghost in the machine. Through the Rossi building's massive transmission array, Dylan's consciousness expanded across the city. He could feel the thousands of people sleeping in the high rises of Canary Wharf, the night shift, workers in the underground, and the restless pulse of the Thames. To Dylan, every person was a unique frequency, a tiny flickering light in a vast, dark ocean. "The connection is stable," the programmer's voice echoed, now sounding like a goddess whispering in the clouds of his mind. "Begin the overture, Dylan. Synchronize them." Dylan felt the Rossi key in his hand vibrate with a terrifying power. It was no longer a tool, it was a conductor's baton made of pure electricity. He began to hum. In the streets of London, people began to stir. They didn't wake up in a panic. They sat up with a strange, glazed look in their eyes. The frequency Dylan was broadcasting was designed to bypass the conscious mind and stimulate the visual cortex. Through the neural link, Dylan saw what they were seeing. A golden veil was being pulled over the city. The gray, rainy streets were being replaced by a vision of impossible beauty, a shared dream of sunlight and harmony. This was Amelia's piece, a digital hallucination that masked the ugliness of reality. "Beautiful, isn't it?" the programmer whispered. "The dissonance is fading. No more crime, no more fear, just the music." But Dylan could hear the cost. Beneath the golden veil, he heard the whining of the human brain being overclocked. He heard the neurons of 8 million people being strained to their breaking point. If the symphony reached its crescendo, the golden dream would become a permanent cage, and their minds would be fried into a static-filled oblivion. "Find the silence," Dylan told himself, his mind reeling under the weight of 8 million heartbeats. "Find the blind spot." He began to accelerate the music. He pushed the frequency higher and higher, forcing the symphony toward its peak. The programmer's voice grew excited, her digital presence pulsing with triumph. "Yes, more! Feed the network, Dylan! Give them everything!" Dylan's vision was now a blinding white storm. He was looking for the 1-second gap Amelia had promised. He was scanning the code of the broadcast, looking for the dissonant note she had hidden. He found it in the middle of the crescendo. It wasn't a sound. It was a mathematical zero. A tiny, hollow pocket of air in the middle of a hurricane. But there was a catch. To trigger the delete key, Dylan had to bring the entire city to a state of perfect resonance. He had to hit a note so pure and so powerful that every receiver in London would be perfectly in sync. For that 1 second, the entire city would be a single, unified ear. And in that second, the surge of power would travel both ways. If he triggered the silence, the feedback loop would hit the Rossi building with enough force to vaporize the neural needles and Dylan's brain along with them. "Dylan, what are you doing?" The programmer's voice suddenly sharpened. She had noticed the shift in the harmonics. "The resonance is too high. You're going to blow the dampers." "I'm finishing the song, Amelia," Dylan whispered into the network, addressing the ghost of the woman who had started it all. He reached the peak. The golden dream over London turned into a blinding, white-hot glare. People in the streets stood perfectly still, their mouths open in a silent, unified note. The programmer screamed, her digital avatar fracturing into 1,000 shards of static. "Disconnect him! Shut it down!" But Dylan was the system now. He locked the doors to the digital vault. He rerouted the cooling systems. He focused every ounce of his will, every memory of the darkness he had lived in for 3 years, and poured it into a single final frequency. "Now," Dylan said. The music stopped. In that 1 second of silence, the delete code rippled through the network. The golden veil over London shattered. The digital hallucinations evaporated. The smart devices across the city sparked and died. And then the feedback hit. Dylan felt a bolt of white-hot agony sear through his temples as the surge from 8 million ears traveled back up the neural needles. His vision exploded into a kaleidoscope of colors he had never seen before. Colors that didn't belong to this world. He felt himself falling, not into the darkness, but into something deeper, something honest. Dylan hit the floor of the vault. The needles had been blown out of the headrest, leaving jagged, smoking holes in the leather. The programmer was slumped over her console, her haptic visor shattered, her brain overloaded by the same silence she had tried to prevent. She wasn't dead, but she would never conduct a symphony again. Dylan lay on the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't feel his hands. He couldn't feel his feet. "Dylan?" Emma Davis's voice was a distant, muffled sound. He felt a warm, wet tongue on his cheek. Leo. The dog's whine was the most beautiful thing Dylan had ever heard. It wasn't a frequency. It wasn't a code. It was just a dog, worried about his friend. "Dylan, look at me." Ethan was kneeling over him, tears streaming down his face. Dylan blinked. He didn't see the silver ripples. He didn't see the gold lattice. He didn't see the neon green of the gas or the violet of the pane. He saw a face. It was blurry. It was out of focus. It was dark and messy. But it was a face. He saw the glint of the emergency lights reflecting in Ethan's eyes. He saw the red exit sign over the door. He wasn't seeing the interface anymore. The feedback had done the impossible. It hadn't just deleted the code. It had jump-started the dormant pathways in his brain. The blind spot was gone. But as Dylan's sight began to clear, he saw something that made his heart stop. On the monitor behind the programmer, a final message was scrolling. Symphony aborted. A backup server activated. Location, Washington, D.C. Subject beta online. Dylan closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the soot on his face. He had saved London, but the music was just moving to a different stage. Chapter 14. The Afterimage. The return of Dylan's sight was not a gift. It was an assault. As they emerged from the bowels of the Rossi building into the grey London dawn, Dylan had to be carried by Emma and Ethan. The world was too loud, too bright, too sharp. Every flickering street lamp felt like a needle pressed into his retinas. The colors of reality were duller than the digital dream he had just shattered, but their weight was crushing. "Close your eyes, Dylan," Emma Davis whispered, pulling her jacket over his head to shield him from the morning light. "Don't look yet. Your brain needs time." But Dylan couldn't close his ears. And now that the blind spot was gone, his hearing had lost its supernatural filter. He could no longer isolate a single heartbeat in a crowd. He was bombarded by the roar of the city, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, the distant clatter of a train, the rhythmic thud of a neighbor's footsteps. It was a cacophony of the mundane. They hid in a safe house, a cramped basement flat in Southwark that smelled of damp paper and stale coffee. For 3 days Dylan sat in total darkness with a bandage wrapped around his eyes, listening to the news. The London silence, as the media called it, was being treated as a massive cyber-terrorist attack. Millions of people had experienced a missing minute, a collective gap in memory followed by the total failure of all electronic communication for 60 seconds. The Rossi organization was being investigated, but their paper trails were dissolving into digital smoke. "The programmer is in a coma," Emma told him on the 4th day, her voice sounding tired but real. "The police found her in the vault. Her brain is scrambled. She's alive, but there's no one home. Arthur Wilson has vanished. And Ethan?" Dylan felt the shift in the air. "Where is he, Emma?" "He's in the next room. He's changed, Dylan. The broadcast did something to the implants. He's hearing things, the same way you used to. You can't turn it off." Dylan stood up, his legs shaky. He reached for his bandage and pulled it off. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle. He saw Emma. She was older than he had imagined, with deep lines of exhaustion around her eyes and a jagged scar on her temple from the warehouse. She looked human. She looked beautiful in her brokenness. "I have to see him," Dylan said. He walked into the kitchen. Ethan was sitting at a wooden table, his head buried in his hands. He was humming the same minor key lullaby, the whistle. It was a low, desperate sound, as if he were trying to drown out a roar only he could hear. "Ethan," Dylan said softly. Ethan looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, his pupils dilated. "It won't stop, Dylan. I can hear the electricity in the walls. I can hear the neighbors thinking. I can hear the Rossi servers. They're still humming. Somewhere across the ocean, they're still humming." Dylan sat across from him. He realized that the after-image wasn't just in his eyes. It was the legacy of what they had done. He had been the alpha, the one who survived and adapted. Ethan was the beta, the one who had been used as a tool and left broken. "Listen to me, Ethan," Dylan said, grabbing his brother's wrists. "You have to focus on the silence. I found it once. You can find it too." "I can't," Ethan sobbed, "because I know what's coming. I heard the handshake, Dylan. Before you crashed the system, I heard the handshake with DC. They're not just going to broadcast a dream there. They're going to broadcast a command. Suddenly, the small radio on the counter crackled to life. It wasn't the news. "They're here," Leo growled, standing by the basement door. The sensory soldiers hadn't been defeated. They had been recalibrated. Through the small, high window of the basement, Dylan saw a flash of red light. Not the digital red of the simulation, but the cold, clinical red of a laser sight. "Emma, get down!" Dylan tackled her as a hail of bullets shattered the kitchen window. This wasn't a sonic attack. This was an old-fashioned execution. The Rossi organization was cleaning its slate. "They don't want the key anymore," Emma shouted over the gunfire, drawing her service weapon. "They want the evidence, and we are the evidence." Dylan looked at Ethan. His brother was staring at the wall, his eyes fixed on something Dylan couldn't see. "The backup?" Ethan whispered. "Dylan, I can see the link. It's coming from the satellite dish on the roof next door. They're using it to relay the kill signal to our implants." Dylan felt a sharp, stabbing pain in his own temple. The after-image in his mind began to pulse. He saw the red laser sights, but he also saw the invisible beam of data connecting the satellite to his own brain. He realized the final twist was closing in. He wasn't just a witness, he was a walking hard drive. Everything he had seen in the vault, the blueprints, the code, the programmer's secrets was stored in his neural pathways. And they were about to format the drive. "I have to get to that roof," Dylan said, his vision blurring as the pain intensified. "You'll never make it," Emma yelled. "There are at least 4 of them out there." "I don't need to see them," Dylan said, a grim smile touching his lips as he reached for the iron wrench he had kept from the vault. "I just need to hear them." Dylan stepped out into the dark alleyway. He closed his eyes. The world of sight vanished, replaced by the familiar, comforting silver ripples of his sonar. But this time, it was different. He had the memory of the light. He knew exactly what the red lasers looked like. He combined the two, the precision of his hearing and the memory of his sight. He was no longer a blind man. He was a seer of the shadows. He moved through the alley like a ghost. He heard the breath of the first sniper on the fire escape, shallow, professional. He heard the click of a safety being disengaged. Dylan didn't whistle. He didn't scream. He simply struck the metal railing of the fire escape with his wrench. The resonance was a physical shockwave. The sniper, wearing haptic enhancement goggles, was momentarily blinded by the sensory feedback. Dylan was on him in a second, disarming him with a fluid movement that was more dance than fight. He reached the roof. The satellite dish was humming. A giant ear turned toward the sky. Dylan stood before it, the wind whipping his hair. He could feel the data flowing through him, a bridge between London and Washington. He held the Rossi key, the one thing he had kept, the device that shouldn't work anymore. "Subject alpha to base," Dylan whispered, his voice hitching. "I know you're listening." A voice crackled through the dish's speakers. It wasn't the programmer. It was a man's voice, deep, American, and terrifyingly calm. "Hello, Dylan. We've been expecting your call. You've done well in the London trial, but the American public is much more receptive to new ideas." "I'm deleting the drive," Dylan said. "You can't. The data is part of your biology now. To delete the code, you have to delete the host." Dylan looked down at the street below. He saw Emma and Ethan emerging from the basement, looking up at him. He saw Leo. "I know," Dylan said. He didn't jump. Instead, he did something the Rossi organization hadn't accounted for. He didn't use the key to stop the signal. He used himself as a filter. He sat cross-legged in front of the dish and began to play a symphony of his own. He hummed a dissonance so complex, so filled with the noise of his own humanity, his grief for Amelia, his anger at his father, his love for his brother, that the satellite couldn't process it. He was poisoning the data. The satellite dish began to groan, its motors grinding as it tried to compensate for the emotional static Dylan was feeding into the line. the dish exploded in a fireball of melting plastic and copper. The link was severed. Dylan was thrown back, his clothes singed, his mind a blank white canvas. When he opened his eyes, the world was quiet, truly quiet. He looked at his hand. The Rossi key had melted into a shapeless lump of slag. He looked at the sky. The stars were there, faint, distant, but real. He had won the battle, but as he looked toward the west, he saw a single bright light moving across the horizon. A satellite. The music hadn't stopped. It was just waiting for the next movement. Chapter 15. The Last Movement. The aftermath of the rooftop explosion felt like a permanent ringing in his soul. Dylan lay on the gravel, his skin stinging from the heat, watching the smoke from the satellite dish curl into the London sky. For the first time in years, the voices in the wires were gone. The symphony had been reduced to a whisper, a dying echo fading into the vastness of the Atlantic. Emma and Ethan reached the roof, breathless. Ethan looked at the melted lump of the Rossi key in Dylan's hand and then at the charred remains of the transmitter. "Is it over?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "The humming. It's different now. It's just wind." Dylan stood up slowly, brushing the ash from his palms. He looked at his brother. He could see Ethan clearly now, not as a collection of glowing wires, but as a man, scarred and weary, but free. "The link is broken, Ethan," Dylan said, "but the music doesn't just stop. It changes form." They didn't stay in London. With Emma's help and a set of clean identities she'd kept for a rainy day, they moved. Not to another city, but to the coast. A small, rugged cottage on the edge of the Scottish Highlands where the only constant sound was the rhythmic, honest thundering of the North Sea against the cliffs. For 6 months, Dylan lived in a world of grey mist and salt air. His sight had stabilized, though he still preferred the dark. The world was softer that way. He spent his days at an old upright piano in the cottage, playing melodies that had no names. He wasn't looking for frequencies anymore. He was looking for peace. Emma visited once a month. She had officially resigned from the force, though Dylan knew she was still tracking the remnants of the Rossi organization. The DC project stalled, she told him one evening, sitting by the peat fire. After the London failure and the poisoned data you sent through the link, the investors got cold feet. The Rossi name is toxic now. Arthur Wilson is still missing, but his bank accounts have been frozen. "And Subject Beta?" Dylan asked, glancing toward the beach where Ethan was walking with Leo. "The implants in Ethan are dormant," Emma said. "Without the broadcast, they're just bits of inert metal." "She's healing, Dylan. We all are." But Dylan knew better. He could still feel the phantom after image sometimes. When the wind blew at a certain angle or the tide hit a specific resonance, he could hear the ghost of the network, a faint digital sigh in the atmosphere. One night, a year after the silence, the wind died down to a perfect, eerie stillness. Dylan was sitting at the piano. He struck a single note, middle C. The sound should have faded into the room. Instead, it sustained. Dylan froze. He didn't move his foot on the pedal. But note hung in the air, vibrating with a familiar metallic edge. Click. The sound came from the corner of the room, a gold lighter. Dylan didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew the rhythm of the breathing behind him. It was slow, measured, and aided by a mechanical hiss. You always did have a gift for the finale, Dylan," the voice said. It was Arthur Wilson, but the baritone was gone, replaced by the thin, reedy whistle of a man breathing through a tube. "You should have stayed dead, Father," Dylan said, his fingers still resting on the key. Rasped. "The organization, the dream, the legacy, you burned it all. I'm just the last vibration before the silence. But I didn't come here to kill you. I came to give you the last piece of the score." Arthur walked, or rather limped, into the firelight. He looked like a hollowed-out version of the man. Dylan remembered. He placed a small digital recorder on the piano. Amelia didn't just record the accident, Dylan. She recorded the response. There is a frequency on that drive that acts as a universal mute, a kill switch for every sensory weapon ever built. She knew if you ever saw the truth, you'd be the only one who could use it without being destroyed by it. "Why give it to me now?" Dylan asked, finally looking at the man who had shaped his darkness. "Because the symphony wasn't ours," Arthur whispered. "We were just the builders, the people in Washington. They've already moved on to the next version. They don't need sound anymore. They're moving into the light, into the visual cortex. If you don't broadcast the mute, the world won't just be deaf, Dylan. It will be blind, truly blind." Arthur turned to leave, his footsteps fading into the sound of the rising tide. "The last movement is yours, conductor. Choose the silence or let the world burn in the light." Dylan picked up the recorder. He felt the familiar hum of the Rossi technology. He looked out the window at the dark Atlantic. He saw Ethan and Leo returning from their walk, silhouettes against the starlight. He had a choice. He could stay here in his quiet cottage and let the world face its fate. Or he could step back into the noise one last time. Dylan sat back at the piano. He didn't play the mute, not yet. He played a simple, haunting melody, the one Amelia had played on her violin before everything broke. He played it with no digital enhancement, no neural needles, no frequencies, just wood, wire, and a man's hands. As the final note died away, Dylan looked at the recorder. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't a witness, a victim, or a subject anymore. He was the silence in the storm. Epilogue, the resonance of the void 6 months later. Dylan Wilson stood on the edge of the jagged cliff, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. In his hand he held the small digital recorder his father had left behind, the mute. He didn't have his cane anymore. He didn't need it. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the slate-gray sky met the churning dark water. His sight was imperfect, fringed with static and prone to sudden flares of light, but it was his. He saw the world as it was, messy, loud, and uncurated. Beside him, Leo sat patiently, his ears perked toward the sea. The dog seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Dylan?" He turned. Ethan was standing a few yards back, his hands deep in his pockets. He looked healthier now, the haunted hollows of his cheeks filled out by the salt air and honest labor. But Dylan could see the slight tilt of Ethan's head, the telltale sign that he was still listening to the undercurrent. "You're going to do it, aren't you?" Ethan asked. "I have to," Dylan replied. "The after image isn't going away, Ethan. It's growing. I can hear the handshake signals getting stronger every night. Washington is ready to go live." "And the mute? What will it do to us, to you?" Dylan looked at the recorder. "It's a permanent sensory blackout for the Rossi frequency. It will burn out the receivers. Every implant, every server, every key. It will be like a door slamming shut. We'll be normal, Ethan. Just two brothers in a quiet world." "And your sight?" Ethan's voice was a whisper. "The doctor said the feedback from the mute might send you back into the dark." Dylan looked at the sea one last time. He saw the white foam of the waves, the deep green of the deep water, and the pale gold of the sun trying to break through the clouds. It was beautiful. It was worth every second of the pain it had cost him to see it. "The darkness was never the problem, Ethan," Dylan said, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "It was the lies we told in it." Dylan pressed the sequence on the recorder. Through the bone conduction of his own body, Dylan felt the signal depart. It hit the cottage's small satellite link and shot upward, hitching a ride on the very network that had tried to enslave him. He felt the ripples spreading out across the globe: London, D.C., Paris, Tokyo. One by one he heard the keys across the world die, a billion tiny digital screams silenced in an instant. And then the feedback hit Dylan's own mind. It wasn't a violent explosion this time. It was a slow, graceful fading. The colors of the sea began to bleed into gray. The sharp outlines of the cliff softened into shadows. The light of the sun dimmed, turning from gold to silver, then to a soft charcoal haze. Dylan didn't fight it. He breathed out, letting the silence take the light. When the signal finished, Dylan stood in total darkness once again. But he didn't feel afraid. He felt Leo's warm fur against his leg. He heard the honest, unamplified sound of his brother's footsteps coming toward him. Dylan? Ethan's hand found his shoulder. Are you okay? Dylan closed his sightless eyes and tilted his head. He listened to the wind. He listened to the waves. He listened to the steady, healthy beat of Ethan's heart. No code, no interference, no Rossi. I'm fine, Ethan, Dylan said, his voice steady and clear. I can finally hear the world again.
Thank you for listening to Blind Spot, a Shiver Audiobook production. We've traveled a long way together. From the velvet-draped stage of a London concert hall to the rain-slick shadows of the underground, and finally into the obsidian heart of the Rossi Vault, where the fate of our minds was decided in a single pulse of silence. Dylan's journey reminds us that in a world governed by cold frequencies and sterile logic, the most powerful thing we still possess is our own beautiful, messy sensory reality. The symphony has been paused, the machine has been met with its match, and the human spirit has finally fought its way back into the light. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please consider leaving a like and sharing the video. It's the best way to help our channel grow and ensures we can keep bringing these high-stakes, cinematic worlds to life. A massive thank you to our subscribers. You are the acoustic resistance that keeps this signal alive. Without your support, stories like this would remain buried in the encrypted dust of the system. Before you go, let us know in the comments. If you found out that your own heartbeat was the only thing keeping the world's sensory reality online, would you embrace the responsibility, or would you fear the burden? Is humanity worth saving at any cost? Until the next frequency is unsealed. Stay alert, stay curious, and keep listening between the lines.